What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. Today I'm trying out something new, something pretty original on the booktube spectrum. I'm just gonna give it a try and we'll see how it goes. I'm calling it reviewing some books. I know, it's a risk, it's a bit of a gamble, but bear with me and I think you might actually enjoy this one. So I mentioned in a couple of videos ago in like a TBR video that I had somehow inadvertently got myself into a bit of a dog-themed readathon during January. As I'm sure you can imagine, Bonnie was very jazzed about that.
Fuck off.
Okay, well, that's just... I read 3 books in which supposedly the dog was the main focus, or one of the main focuses of the story. Dogs. Doggos. Woofers. Puppers. Big paws, small paws, snooty boys, snooty girls. I will do my best to keep spoilers out of these reviews, and I will mention beforehand if I need to mention a spoiler for the sake of the review. The books I'm reviewing today, and I'll leave some time cards in case you came to see a review on a specific book so you can jump to that time. We have A Dog's Purpose, The Art of Racing in the Rain, and Waiting for Doggo. I also read another couple of things around that time that I won't be talking about in the video today because it doesn't fit in with the theme. Plus, one of them's Fight Club, and that could be a whole video in itself, and maybe it will be one day, but if you want to see my review on that, this is a good opportunity for me to plug my Goodreads. If you're not following me on Goodreads, I highly recommend doing that. Obviously, the link will be in the description below. That's where you can see what I'm currently reading, some reviews for stuff that I probably won't mention in videos, just basically the book-related stuff. Goodreads. Facebook for virgins. Goodreads. Facebook for people who get sunburnt easy. Goodreads. Facebook for people who have crippling social anxiety. So the first book I'm reviewing today is A Dog's Purpose by W. Bruce Cameron. Oh, there it is. You may be familiar with A Dog's Purpose in that it was actually also a film as well, quite a popular film at that. Luckily I watched the movie at home, so no one saw my tears. So when it came time to read the book, I figured, I've been through this, I'm not gonna cry, it'll be fine. But no, I was not fine. Next thing I know, I find myself at work, tearing up on my lunch break. I was reading the book, and particularly a sad part of the book, while I was eating my dinner, and the lunchroom was quite full at this time, mind you. But being the quick thinker I am, I did what most white dudes in my situation would do, and I said that my chicken teriyaki was too spicy. So crisis avoided. No one knew I was crying at a dog book. They just thought I have a laughably low tolerance to spicy food, or food that isn't even spicy. Anyway, in terms of the movie, I want to point out something that I think is quite important. I imagine for a lot of you, the first thing that comes to mind when I mention A Dog's Purpose movie is the allegations of animal cruelty that came up. Unfortunately, not as many people know that those allegations were debunked entirely. An independent investigation was carried out in full, and they found that the footage that was used to make it look like the dog was in a bad situation was actually heavily edited, and at no point was the dog in any danger or any real distress. That's all I'll say on that, but I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to go have a read of the full story around the debunking of that just stupid situation. Just some absolute fucking clown using fake animal cruelty to try and get some clout. That's all it was. So A Dog's Purpose follows a dog, obviously, which I will refer to as Bailey, being that that's, I guess, the central life of the dog. Bailey actually goes through a number of lives in that every time he dies, he is reincarnated as another dog with another family. The most important of those lives and families is when the dog is known as Bailey, and he is the much-loved companion to a boy named Ethan, or as Bailey calls him for the most part, the boy.
This way, boy. Slow down, boy. Boy. Boy, look at me. Look at me, boy. Boy. Inside, boy.
Now, there's no real A to B plot in that it builds, hits a climax, and goes, down again to a steady finish. It more so has a lot of tiny little sub-stories along the way, and that works in that it's broken into segments. In each of Bailey's lives, he has goals and missions that he needs to carry out, and yet they still feel linked by Bailey's desire to one day make it home to the boy. So I'm going to go into some of the pros and cons that I had with this story. Like I said, I'm going to try and keep spoilers out of it, although it's inevitable that I might mention some things that you would see as a spoiler if you haven't seen the movie or read the book. If you've seen the movie, I think you're going to be completely safe for me to talk about this because it's almost all the same, except for the ending. If I was to wrap my whole review up in a kind of spoiler-free sentence though, I would just say it's a fun, light-hearted approach to love and family through a dog's eyes, as you would much expect it. And although being for a younger audience, it does still have some nauseatingly cheesy moments that just felt a bit contrived. So what did I like about A Dog's Purpose? One of the first things that comes to mind is that although it's dealing with the idea of reincarnations through this story, it doesn't really dive into any deep existential topics, and I appreciate that because A, it's again for a younger audience, and B, it would ruin the entire mood of the story. Like I said, it's meant to be a lighthearted, feel-good approach to the idea of the purpose of life. And although Bailey is reincarnated every time he dies, he never really sees it as immortality. That's something that's never really addressed, and again, I think that's appropriate for the theme of the story. One thing that Bruce did really well with this story is that he kept the mood and the atmosphere completely appropriate through almost the entire story, although he was dealing with what some people could see as quite a deep and heavy topic. The biggest credit worth giving in The Dog's Purpose, I think, is that each of the lives are done very well, exceptionally well, I would even say. Although Bailey's personality kind of remains the same through all of the lives, the families and the situations and the lessons and the challenges that he has in each of these lives is almost completely different from each life. Each of the lives that Bailey is put into, they kind of address one of the different ideas that people have about what may be the purpose of life, and I think that's done really well. I'm not going to explain or describe all of the different lives because I think that's part of the joy of reading the book, is finding out what the different lives are, although I do want to mention that my favorite one was when Bailey was a female dog named Ellie, who belonged to a SARS or Search and Rescue police officer named Jacob. Jacob, I think, had one of the most interesting and well-developed stories in the whole book. I think his character arc was probably the most compelling. Plus, my favorite part from the whole book happened to be during that segment, and that was the storm drain sequence. That was a part in the book where I genuinely felt adrenaline and suspense. Even though I had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen, it was still very exciting. Where is it? I realized that today I truly understood my purpose as Ellie, not just to find people, but to save them. The writing style in this book was sometimes pretty campy, and that's what I'm going to get into when I talk about the things I didn't like, but it was fluid and smooth and it didn't feel choppy at any points. The story ran quite smoothly. Now, the ending to the book, again, I'm not going to spoil, but it was pretty damn different to the movie, and it wasn't really as satisfying as the movie. And while that could easily be seen as a con, I think the ending to the book actually felt a bit more appropriate in line with the story itself. It made a bit more sense and it felt more natural, although again, wasn't as satisfying, I guess. I had fulfilled my purpose. So, what didn't I like? At so many points during the story, Bailey was frustratingly naive, and I get it. It's a dog. It's told pretty much through the personality of a dog. Bailey doesn't understand English or social cues, that sort of thing. But yet there's still points in the book where his understanding of what's going on doesn't feel very consistent. He understands things that he really shouldn't understand if we're to take into account the thing that he didn't understand just a few pages before that. And while it's just a product of reading a story about a dog, it does tend to grind your gears a fair bit when there's a situation that could be so easily resolved by Bailey just understanding what's going on, and he doesn't. It's just, again, he's a dog, I guess. Just, yeah, a bit inconsistent sometimes. Now, the villains in this book, or the antagonists, being that there isn't really one major villain through the whole story, they're pretty two-dimensional for the most part. The main one that would come to most people's minds is during the Ethan and Bailey saga of the book. And that's the shit stain of a character named Todd, who is essentially your run-of-the-mill, textbook, cliched future serial killer. He likes to torture animals, he's incredibly jealous and possessive. And when you read about him as the reader, it just feels kind of surface level. It feels like there's so much potential for a fleshed out and three-dimensional character, and yet that's just not really what we get. The bad people in this book are essentially boiled down to people that don't like dogs, and the good people are people that do like dogs. I just would have really loved some exploration more into the villains, more specifically Todd. I feel like there would have been a great kind of B-plot there if they just explored that a bit more. The last thing I would say for things I didn't like about this book is just that although I mentioned before that the outlook on the purpose of life is perfectly toned for this book, it can be seen as a negative, being that it's so surface level and basic. If you're picking up this book hoping to have an epiphany and learn some kind of deep life understanding or lesson, That's just not going to happen. The general message is basically like your standard Steve Carell movie. It's just love the people that are around you and look after others. So yeah, that's the pros and cons of A Dog's Purpose, to me at least. And if I was to wrap up the whole thing in any way, I would just say that ultimately, what I took away from this book is that you can attach the purpose of life to almost anything, and for everyone or different people, it's going to be different things. And instead of seeing the purpose of life as one thing, maybe we should be looking at it as more of a spectrum. Bailey learns that the purpose of life, to him at least, is, protecting others, looking after himself, loving who he has, and essentially just looking at all of the positive and negative impacts that you put out into the world. A Dog's Purpose gets 4 good boys out of 5. That's pretty good. It's a pretty good score. The Art of Racing in the Rain. Now, this one is completely different to the last book, aside from the fact it centers around a dog. Where the last book was a lighthearted look at the purpose of life through the eyes of a dog, this one deals with some more complex and just adult themes. Even the dog in this book, Enzo, has a completely different personality and understanding of life to that of Bailey from the previous book. The plot to The Art of Racing in the Rain is that it starts off with, and I kind of appreciate this by the way, it starts off with Enzo dying, so it gets that out of the way. Because let's face it, that's a thing with like movies and books and TV shows that involve animals. They always kill them off at the end. They just do. It's a cheap way for most forms of media to trick you into thinking that you had some strong kind of emotion during the experience. But this book gets it out of the way first thing. It starts with Enzo as dying, and the story, the whole book, is Enzo reflecting on his life and the things that he has learned. Enzo too believes that he will be reincarnated, except he is convinced that when he comes back, he will come back as a man. He's learned from sitting in front of the television that through some beliefs, dogs achieve a certain level of enlightenment, and then they can come back as a human. The story follows Enzo and his master Denny, who is a professional race car driver, as they go through, love, loss, family, and some other things that we'll get into in just a minute. Denny has to deal with his wife being diagnosed with cancer and the domino effect that comes as a consequence of that. Again, there might be some things you could see as spoilers. I'm going to try my best to keep them out of this, but if I'm going to mention anything big, I'll give you a warning, don't worry. My quick summary of this book would be that it's a heartbreaking journey of a man and his dog. It goes through love, loss, family, and taking lessons from what you love to help you cope with hard times or even good times through life. It's beautifully written, it has fantastic and fleshed out characters, although it is kind of peppered with cliches and quite a few inconsistencies that spoil the immersion from time to time. So, what I liked. Yes. The story itself, it's brilliant. It's emotional. It's visceral. It covers a number of heartbreaking topics in a way that I feel is appropriate and accurate. There's 3 major battles for Denny and Enzo through the book, and all of them are just gut-wrenching to read about. I liked the writing in the book. Garth has a very particular writing style, and I find it quite clever. He can go a bit heavy on the metaphors from time to time, although in most cases it feels pretty leveled out, and it feels like when he is making a metaphor or an allegory, he's doing it quite purposefully. Allegories are done a lot in this book, and in fact it's even done in the title of the book itself, The Art of Racing in the Rain. They're all comparisons to strategies that Denny, who is a professional race car driver, uses in his racing. One of Denny's specialties is being able to handle his car in the rain, something that not a lot of other drivers can do, and it makes a lot of comparisons and parallels between being able to do that and the techniques in being able to do that to techniques to deal with when your life is kind of spiraling out of control. I'm going to read you out an example. It's towards the end of the book. It's not a spoiler or anything like that, but it's just an example of one of the allegories that fits in with that segment of the story. He uses these racing analogies to kind of square you up with where Enzo is emotionally. It just helps you better get in the mood of that point of the story. Racing is about discipline and intelligence, not about who has the heavier foot. The one who drives smart will always win in the end. That bit there has a very important parallel to what's happening at that point in the story, and I thought it just fit beautifully. And you're probably thinking, Cam, I don't have an interest in race cars or automotive sport. Do you think I do? No, sir. Not at all. My knowledge and interest in cars doesn't go that far past getting the Jelly Belly car fresheners. But despite the fact I have no interest in automotive sport or cars in general, the analogies still worked for me. Like I said before, they help you square up with what's happening at that point in the story, and it helps you square up with where Denny and Enzo are emotionally. The characters in this story were absolutely fantastic. All of the characters came with their own distinct personalities and the things that made them who they are. You could tell them apart from each other really easily, even without taking the names into account. And it's done with enough care and attention that even applies to some of the smaller side characters that aren't there for very long. For example, at a point in the story, there's a lawyer named Mark B, with a capital B. He's loud, he's boisterous, he's a real cut-to-the-chase kind of guy, and that comes along in the first couple of paragraphs that you're introduced to him. And yet it's still done naturally. It's not thrown in your face. The character of Denny in particular is, well, let's be real, he's the main character through the story, even more so than Enzo, I would say, despite the fact that the story is told through Enzo's eyes. All of the challenges that come about are challenges thrust directly onto Denny, and seeing him cope with these and seeing how his approach to these challenges changes along the way, it's just super interesting. And he has flaws of his own, and yet he's still an extremely likable character. You want him to overcome these things. You get very invested in Denny as a character. You get quite attached, I would even say. His wife Eve is also a pretty interesting character in her own right, from the time she's introduced to the time she's diagnosed with cancer. And while her distrust of medicine and doctors felt really weird and out of place, she still had very clear motivations, and everything she did made sense for where she was at in the story. Now, what didn't I like? Again, this is something that I mentioned for the last book as well, but Enzo was at a lot of points frustratingly inconsistent. One of the major differences, though, between Enzo and Bailey is that Enzo understands English. He understands social situations and complex social cues, that sort of thing. He understands all of this. And although people don't understand what he's saying because, as he refers to it in the book, his stupid dog tongue, Enzo completely understands everything that is said and everything that is happening, even down to a level of, the laws being discussed. And yet, even with that in mind, there is some really obscure, super basic common things that for whatever reason he doesn't understand, like sex. It's explained that he learned all of this stuff, including his understanding of English and social cues, from sitting in front of the television. And I mean, that's an interesting way to look at it, but if you were to believe that all of this extensive, and it's quite extensive knowledge that he has, came from watching television, all of the things that he doesn't understand just end up being glaring inconsistencies. It kind of throws you out of the story when you come to a bit where he's describing watching Denny and Eve have sex, and he doesn't really know what's going on. And he's describing this just after giving some big philosophical spiel. It feels weird, and it feels incredibly inconsistent. The character of Zoe, the daughter, wasn't a very interesting character, and to be honest, I felt she was more of a driving force for the story, more of a plot device. I guess you could say more of a prop. And I get that she's a child, but even with that in mind, she barely has a personality. The next negative's kind of a weird one to look back on because it's something that feels necessary for the story to work the way it does, but at the same time, it's just worth mentioning, and that's that, for the most part, Enzo was barely a dog. At a lot of points in the story, it's really easy to forget that the story is told through the eyes of a dog because of how full Enzo's understanding of English language and, social interaction is. The only time you're reminded of the fact that he's a dog is when it comes to his physical limitations or the way people speak to him. With that fact in mind, I would probably say if you're after a book that is quite obviously a dog book, I just don't think this is that. Another negative I want to mention, I guess, is a spoiler. So if you don't want to hear this, you can skip ahead 20 seconds, although I don't think it's a spoiler. I don't think it's really that important to the plot of the story in any way. But if you don't want to hear it, just skip ahead 20, 30 seconds. There's this kind of weird, very subtle running plot during the story where Enzo, although being very wise and smart, is comparing this zebra stuffed toy thing to being a demon that is driving all of the negative actions through the story, and it only comes up 2 or 3 times, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and honestly, I think it doesn't really fit in anywhere in the story. It was just kind of stupid and didn't need to be there. I thought the whole zebra thing could have been tossed out. The next negative isn't a spoiler, so don't worry, but it's that the writing style in the story, although, like I said before, is really good, I think Garth Stein did a pretty damn good job, actually. You can count on 2 hands the points where it got too cheesy. The moments became a situation of just try to be happy and you'll be happy. You know what I mean? That there were like the visualize it and it will come true messages through this book that were just butted on a bit too thick. And to be honest, I just think it kind of took away from some of the great messages of the book. For example, the importance of taking a slow and thought out approach to things that are kind of throwing you out of control. But yeah, that's all the things I like and dislike about this book. If I was to wrap it up in any way, I would say that the characters had depth, the story was complex and heartbreaking. It was a twisting roller coaster of emotion nearly from start to end, and the ending itself and the aftertaste that the ending leaves you with was completely satisfying, although I won't say in which way that is. I would highly recommend this book if melancholy isn't something that you actively avoid. The Art of Racing in the Rain gets 4 good boys out of 5 as well. Last but not least, we have Waiting for Doggo by Mark Mills. This one's actually a reread for me. You might remember I did a review on this quite a long time ago, but it's something that I've wanted to reread for quite a long time because I mentioned in my review way back, I think it was like 2017, that the story kind of left me with a confusing feeling, and that's that I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved it, in fact, although it kind of shouldn't have worked. This story is different from the other two I mentioned for a lot of reasons. The first one I would say is because it's told from the view of the guy, not the dog. And like I just mentioned, it shouldn't work. There's no build up towards a climax. There's no major villain or antagonist, or there's not even really a major goal that the antagonist has, and there's not really anyone that would be barring them from it. There's just a whole lot of sequential small things. So the story centers around a guy named Dan who has just been dumped, freshly dumped. We've all been there, right? He's just been dumped by his hyper-spiritual girlfriend. She's left the country and left him with the dog that she had just gotten for them, which is this small, ugly little mutt named Doggo. And that's not my words, that's something that's reinforced through the story as one of the main traits of Doggo, is that he's not very easy on the eyes. And really there's not a whole lot more to say about the plot of the story because like I said, it's pretty basic. It just follows Dan and Doggo kind of slowly building a relationship with each other while they're introduced to new prospects of love and success. And I don't know, it's just, I struggle to find a way to describe this book and do it justice on how great of a read it is, because there's just not a whole lot to say about it, and yet it works. My quick summary on Waiting for Doggo would be that although it's extremely light on plot, extremely light on conflict, the story of Dan and his ugly dog is a super, super charming and fun trip that would be perfect for reading maybe before bed or just on the commute to work. What do I like about Waiting for Doggo? Now, the major appeal of Waiting for Doggo is that it is essentially the book version of one of those feel-good indie short films. You know, the short films that are like 5 minutes or so and for whatever reason feature like one A-list celebrity and they just make you feel good. Not a whole lot really happens in them, but they're fun. It can probably be attributed to how small the book is, but I think a major selling point for this story is how authentic the characters feel. They feel very real. They all, including the side characters, have personalities and motivations that seem completely natural. For example, the main character, Dan, he's incredibly witty and he's quite clever, but he's also pretty damn petty, as most people are in the wake of a breakup. He does something immediately following the breakup that I just know a lot of people would read and be like, wow, what a shit guy. But that's the thing. It's a flaw of his. He's a petty guy, and it's, I don't know. I mean, he does a pretty shitty thing, but it's not like an evil thing. It's just petty. Is what it is. The romance in this book felt pretty damn unique and I actually really, really liked it. I don't think it would work in a longer story, but I think that was also quite deliberate. It's not love at first sight. Some of the actions during this romance are morally questionable, for sure, but that just adds to how authentic and real it feels because that's how it happens for a lot of people out here in the real world. The love interest in the story as well, the love interest was very likable. She too had some personality traits that wouldn't really align with the perfect person, but that just adds to it. Even Doggo himself is pretty consistent through the entire story, and one thing I liked about Doggo is that he's not your standard super friendly, loves everyone kind of dog. He's actually pretty grouchy. Doggo's kind of a dick, just being honest, but that's what makes Doggo's kind of little character arc all the more enjoyable. What didn't I like about Waiting for Doggo? Here's the thing. Almost all of the things I didn't like about this book, if they weren't the way they were, the things I do like wouldn't work either. So they're kind of necessary. For example, the first thing that I would note as a con is that there is no real climax to the story. There is no real conflict, so to speak. The expected structure of a story is that it rises, and it might have a few dips here and there, but it rises to a certain point, the climax, and that's when the big thing happens, the big confrontation, and then there's a steady decline. That's not really a thing in this story. This story is kind of just a flat line with a few bumps along the way. There are antagonists in this story, but none of them are particularly villainous. I mean, they're self-centered and they have their own little goals, but truthfully, they're just not that important to the story. I feel like it's good that they're there for the conflict they do provide, but they don't really matter that much. I am willing to put aside that one of these antagonists was an Australian.
What the fuck?
I guess another thing that you could see as a con is that Doggo himself isn't really a key player in the story until the very end. I mean, ultimately, yeah, this is a story about a relationship building between a dog and a human, but there's no real bonding event in the story. Their relationship just kind of strengthens over time and circumstance. They don't really go through anything together, really, that bonds them together, and that kind of sucked. I wish there was at least one thing that really thrust them together. And yet somehow at the end it's still incredibly sweet, the attachment they have. But yeah, that's all the things I liked and didn't like about Waiting for Doggo. I'm actually going to give this one 5 good boys out of 5 good boys, because I think Mark Mills here has pulled off something that shouldn't have worked. He's made something that should have been a crap story work. And I'm pretty sure I've figured out why. It's entirely because of the length. This is a bite-sized story. You could not have dragged this out any longer. It would not have worked. And I think Mark knows that. And I think the fact that all of the cons are almost flip-side pros, I'm just struggling to see a reason that I don't give this one 5 stars. My summary would be that if you're after a relaxing, charming read with little commitment needed whatsoever, I would highly recommend Waiting for Doggo. It's probably like a couple of hours out of your day at most, and I think it's a good use of your time. Waiting for Doggo feels like a real palate cleanser. It would be like watching a whole ton of fantasy movies like Lord of the Rings and then some Game of Thrones and then going and watching an episode of, I don't know, Scrubs or something. But yeah, there it is. I didn't mean to do a dog readathon, but I did. They're all thoroughly enjoyable books. I'm currently working my way through another slight readathon, reading books written by Black authors, and that's another video I'll be doing with all the reviews for those, which shouldn't be too long, actually. I think that'll probably be like next week, but I have a really fun video I want to do before that. Anyway, if you've read any of these, let me know what you thought of them below, or if you're thinking of reading them because of me, tell me so I can feel good about myself. This one was for all the people who say I don't read books. Who's laughing now, mister? Suck my ass. God, what if kids watch this? One of my old book reviews kind of blew up with, like, kids lately. And I'm cool with that. It was like, one of my Morris Gleitzman Once reviews, and it just kind of blew up with kids. I don't know why. And thank God I didn't make even half the jokes I do in my videos now in that one. But I feel like this video, more than most of my others, has the potential to draw a young audience. So probably shouldn't be saying things like, suck my ass, but fuck it.